Hello, so following on from my overview of sampling, this particular recording focuses on quantitative sampling. And as you can see from the red bubble there, this is when you're doing your dissertation, you will need to specify the strategy you're proposing for sampling. You need to explain why it's appropriate to your study and how it will actually be implemented, or how it was implemented in practice. So, a couple of recaps. With quantitative studies, what we're aiming for is a probability sample, because we want to make our study as representative as possible. But even with a probability sample, we can never be totally sure that it's representative, but it gives us a better chance. And also there are a number of issues with trying to use probability sampling in quantitative studies, particularly in the events, tourism, hospitality and sport areas. So I've mentioned before there are sort of sampling frame issues in this area, we don't always have a list of all the people who take part in particular activities. So for example, here I've said, is there a sampling frame for people who go to the beach? No. People who drink beer? No. People who go to nightclubs? No. It may be that you can create a list by actually having maybe a list of people who go to your event. There's sometimes we have lists, or we can compile a list in some way. I've got an example there. Do you have a list of all event management companies? You might be able to get that from industry databases. But generally, in the areas that you're interested in, sampling frames are hard to come by and often don't exist. So, first of all, I'm going to talk you through probability samples. Now, these are if you do have a sampling frame. And as I say, most of you won't have a sampling frame, but these are options if you do. The first one is random, a truly random sample. So if I have a sampling frame, that gives me a complete list of all the people who could take part in the study. And from that, I can select a sample to take part. And I could do this on the basis of random number tables or random number generators. So you don't just choose the first 300 people on that list. You actually use some system for actually picking out randomly your 300 people, so that it isn't just biased to the people whose names begin with A, for instance. Okay, so that would be a random approach. Now, most of you are not going to be able to do that, and you need to use the word random carefully in dissertations, because quite often people talk about doing a random sample and actually they haven't. They've done a convenience sample, but they feel like they're choosing people randomly. You're not, I'm afraid. So it means something very specific here. And go and have a read around this if you're not sure. And then there's systematic sampling, which is a kind of quasi-random sampling approach. So you've got your list of people in your sampling frame. Maybe you've got 3,000 people there and you want a sample of 300. You could pick every 10th person. So you systematically go through that list and pick every 10th person, and that would give you 300 people for your sample. Okay, so that's another possibility. And then the stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is where we divide the population up according to some criteria that we might have. It could be age groups, for example, and then within that we do some kind of random sampling. So I know that within the population there might be 20% of people who are aged 20 to 30, and therefore in my sample I will do a random sample to get 20% of my total participants would be from that age group by some random means. To be honest, I've never quite myself seen the point of doing that as opposed to doing random sampling, but I know where they are used, and they are used with panel surveys and some of the survey companies who can be paid to distribute questionnaires for you, and they tend to use this sort of approach. Then there's a clustered sampling. So clustered sampling tries to avoid a lot of travel and researcher time. So what you often do is often by some random means pick particular locations for a study, and then you choose populations randomly that are clustered at those locations. And I've got an example of some work that one of my PhD students did with clustered sampling using postcodes in Bournemouth. Unless you have multi-stage, and multi-stage can involve a mixture of different strategies. So possibly a clustered approach where you randomly identify some towns where you're going to do your study, and then you implement a random sampling strategy within those locations. Now, having said all that, most of you are going to be using non-probability samples if you're doing quantitative research in the fields that you're interested in. Now, the first option is a quota sample. This is actually used very commonly in market research, and if you've ever been stopped on the street and asked to take part in a survey, they're almost certainly using a quota sample, and you happen to meet the characteristics of one of the quotas they need to fill that day. So in my case, they stopped me because I'm a middle-aged woman, and they maybe haven't fulfilled their quota of middle-aged women that day. So basically, you need to know the characteristics of your population. So I gave an example in the previous recording on gym. People who attend gyms, use gyms. You might well look up in some market research data to find out what the characteristics of that population is, what age groups are involved, genders, that kind of thing, and then work out a quota based on that. And then you find people to complete, say, a questionnaire on the basis of meeting the targets for the number of people you need in each of the age groups that you're interested in. Okay, and then convenience sampling. This is what most of you are likely to do and has all sorts of problems of bias, and it's not representative, but it's very useful in events, tourism, leisure, sports types contexts. So convenience sample is basically based on the idea that you find people through some convenient method who are able to complete your study. So if, for instance, in tourism, if you did an on-site survey at a destination, that's a convenience sample. If you administered a questionnaire at a live event, that's a convenience sample. If you use social media to identify people who participate in a particular sport to complete a questionnaire, that's a convenience sample, and that's what a lot of you will use. But you do need to take some care and explain how you're approaching that to try to reduce the bias and make it more representative. I've talked briefly before about how big samples should be. In quantitative research, larger samples generally are more accurate at measuring the population. A lot depends on how robust your sampling strategy is. If you're using a good random sample, we might be able to get away with smaller sample sizes. The level of variability in the population is part of the problem, and that can lead to needing larger sample sizes. The problem is, unless you're using a probability method, and unless you've got a lot of time and resources, most students will find their samples aren't huge. I generally think if a student's managed to collect 150 questionnaires, that's pretty good. Although if I was doing research in a project myself, I'd be looking at over 300, and I'd be expecting my PhD students to get more than that. Anything less than about 150 and you're really struggling with the data analysis. So I've said there, analysis considerations may dictate sampling size. So I know you probably haven't read or listened to any videos on data analysis yet, but if you're using something like the chi-squared test that some of you might be familiar with, 150 can be quite a small sample size for that, depending on how many groups you're trying to compare in that analysis. So there are ways of calculating sample size if you're using a random sampling, and you can go and look at textbooks for help with that. Various issues here I've flagged with questionnaire surveys, particularly in sampling issues, and you can sort of see that there's many of them aren't representative. So for instance, there I've mentioned on-street surveys. If you're surveying at a leisure site, maybe a tourism attraction, a sports facility, they're not representative. If you're using social media that many of you will use, they won't be representative. And you can sort of see the relative cost implications of some of these different approaches. So doing household surveys, they're expensive, but the response rate is good, and they can be representative random, but it's a lot of hard work to implement them. So you do need to kind of think about these kinds of issues. A couple of examples here. So This is from a master's student dissertation from a few years ago, which eventually we got published in Tourism Management as a journal article after some additional work. And it was looking at basically seaside visitors' perceptions of coastal erosion related to climate change. There wasn't a sampling frame because there isn't a sampling frame of seaside visitors. And so what she did was she used the beach intercept survey. So basically she approached people on beaches, so they were the beach visitors. It's a convenient sampling approach, but what she did to try to make it more representative was she randomly picked a starting point each day. She divided the beach, it was quite a big beach, Studland Beach actually, into different segments, and then through using a random numbering approach picked a different area to start at each day. And then at that point she selected 6 people, gave out the questionnaire to 6 people, waited while they completed them, got them back in. She walked approximately 100 metres, she couldn't measure this, so she just kind of guessed, and then did another 6 people. And so she tried to randomise it as much as possible, and she recorded that quite carefully in her dissertation and also in the subsequent research paper that we published. Then the second example, this is actually one of my PhD students. He was looking at tourist perceptions of climate change and travel issues. Again, no sampling frame because actually what he needed was people who had taken an international holiday in the last 3 years. So, you know, there was no list of that. You can't create a sampling frame for that. He used a drop and collect household survey. So he knocked on doors, gave them the questionnaire, said he would come back the following day to collect them. He used a clustered sampling approach. So he had a list of Bournemouth postcodes based on the post office database, and he randomly selected from that postcodes some particular postcode locations, and he dropped and collected questionnaires at 40 of these postcode locations, and in total he approached 1,200 households. So it's a sort of fairly detailed process and more than you would normally manage on a dissertation project. He had a good response rate. He got 700 returned, and part of this was due to the personal touch of actually knocking on doors and collecting them. And you could argue this was representative of the Bournemouth area, but not the UK. So Bournemouth is generally, there are areas that aren't affluent in Bournemouth, but it is a relatively affluent part of the country. Okay, so that maybe gives you some ideas, but it also, those 2 examples as well show the kind of detail you might need to talk about in a dissertation.